morning I took that lift wasn't supposed to mean anything. It was just one of those long days where the sky felt heavier than usual and my phone battery died. Before I could book a ride, I had stayed late at work, pretending to be busy so I wouldn't have to rush home to the same quiet routine. Mark and I had been together for years, and from the outside, everything looked fine. We shared an apartment, plans, and history, but somewhere along the way, we had stopped sharing ourselves. Conversations became practical, affection became scheduled, and silence slowly learned how to live between us. Asterisk, it had started raining when I stepped out onto the street. Not a dramatic storm, just enough to make the city glow under the lights. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, when a car slowed down beside me. The window rolled down and a calm voice asked if I needed a lift. I hesitated. I wasn't reckless, just tired. He introduced himself as Lucas. His tone wasn't pushy, just kind. Like someone who understood hesitation. Asterisk, I told myself it was harmless. The ride would be short. I got in. Asterisk, the car smelled faintly of coffee and something clean, familiar. Soft music played low in the background, the kind you don't notice until it's gone. Lucas kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. We talked about small things at first, traffic, the weather, how unpredictable evenings could be. It was easy to easy. There was no pressure to impress, no expectations. Just words filling the space. Asterisk, at some point, he asked how my day had been. It was such a simple question, but it landed differently. I almost gave the automatic answer, but something in his voice made me pause. I said it had been long. He nodded, like he understood exactly what that meant. We felt quiet for a few seconds, and instead of feeling awkward, it felt comfortable. Asterisk, I noticed how relaxed I was. My shoulders dropped, my thoughts slowed. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until that moment. Lucas mentioned he drove at night because he liked the calm, the honesty people seem to have after dark. I smiled at that, even though it hit close to home. Night had a way of making truths louder. Asterisk, without meaning to, I started talking about feeling stuck. I didn't mention Mark by name, but I talked about being in a relationship that looked solid but felt distant. Lucas didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice. He just listened, really listened, like my words mattered. That alone felt dangerously comforting. Asterisk, I knew even then that I was stepping into emotional territory I should have been careful with. There was nothing inappropriate happening, nothing anyone could point to and call wrong. But inside, something was shifting. I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time, and that realization scared me more than the quiet road ahead. Asterisk, Lucas shared a little about himself too. How he learned that people don't always leave relationships because they stop loving, but because they stop feeling understood. His words stayed with me. I stared out the window, watching the rain trace lines down the glass, thinking about how accurate that felt. Asterisk, the ride was supposed to be 10 minutes. It felt shorter and longer at the same time. When Lucas told me we were almost there, a strange disappointment settled in my chest. I didn't want the moment to end, and that thought alone made me uneasy. I reminded myself of who I was, of the life waiting at home, of the promises I had made. Asterisk, as the car slowed near my street, I realized I hadn't checked my phone once. I hadn't thought about time. For those few minutes, the world had narrowed down to a quiet car, a steady voice. Feelings I wasn't ready to name. Asterisk, I thanked him for the lift, trying to sound normal, casual. Lucas smiled, polite and warm, and said he was glad he could help. As I reached for the door handle, our eyes met briefly. There was no spark you could point at, no dramatic pause. Just an unspoken understanding that something had passed between us, something subtle, something real. Asterisk, I stepped out into the rain, the car pulling away behind me. I stood there longer than I needed to, watching the red lights disappear. I told myself it was nothing, just a ride, just a conversation, asterisk, but as I walked toward my building, heart heavier than before. I knew that something had already changed. I didn't expect to see him again. But that night, I told myself the memory would fade, that it would blend into all the other moments life throws at you and then quietly takes back. But memories don't work that way when they touch a part of you that's been asleep for too long. Over the next few days, I caught myself replaying his voice. The way silence in that car had felt less lonely than the rooms in my own apartment. Asterisk, life went on as usual. Mark asked about my day, and I answered answered with safe words. We ate dinner in front of the TV, shoulders close but minds far apart. Nothing was wrong, and that somehow felt worse. I kept thinking about how easily I had opened up to a stranger, how carefully I edited myself at home. The guilt crept in quietly, not loud enough to confront, just persistent enough to follow me. A week later, the rain came back light and steady, like it had unfinished business. Left work late again, the streets shining the same way they had that first night. This time, I didn't miss my ride by accident. I stood there longer than necessary, telling myself I was just waiting for the traffic to clear. When a familiar car slowed near the curb, my heart reacted before my mind could catch up. Lucas rolled down the window, surprise softening into a smile. He didn't ask why I was there or where I was going. He just asked if I wanted a lift. I hesitated longer this time. Every reason not to get in lined up neatly in my head. And still, I opened the door. The ride felt different. The air carried awareness now, like both of us knew this wasn't just coincidence. The music was the same, low and unobtrusive, but my pulse was louder. We laughed a little about how small the city suddenly felt. Lucas mentioned he almost didn't recognize me at first, then admitted he'd hoped it was me. That confession was gentle, not heavy, but it landed with a weight. At a red light. He glanced over and asked if I'd been okay. The question was simple, but it wasn't casual. I answered honestly, more honestly than I meant to. I told him I'd been thinking. He nodded like that was enough explanation. There was something comforting in not having to explain everything. The road ahead opened into a quieter stretch, fewer cars, fewer distractions. Lucas slowed down and, after a moment, pulled over near a small park. He didn't turn off the engine right away. He just said he needed a moment. My chest tightened. Part of me wanted to ask why. Another part already knew this wasn't about directions. We sat there. The rain tapping softly against the roof, the city breathing around us. Lucas broke the silence first. He talked about a past relationship, about how it ended not with an argument, but with indifference. He said betrayal doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like being invisible next to someone who promised to see you. I felt exposed. Like he was reading a page from my own life. I admitted I hadn't realized how lonely I'd been until that night in his car. Saying it out loud made it real, and reality carried responsibility. Lucas didn't move closer. He didn't touch me. He just listened, eyes steady, presence grounded. Then he said something that settled deep in my chest. He said that sometimes people don't cross lines with their actions, but with their honesty. And that honesty can be the most dangerous thing of all. I knew exactly what he meant. Sitting there, sharing truths I'd hidden from the person I loved. I felt the weight of that line beneath me, thin and trembling. Time stretched. The world outside the car faded into background noise. For a moment, it felt like the only choice that existed was whether to stay in that silence or break it. I thought of Mark, of our shared mornings, our history, the life we'd built. I also thought of how alive I felt in that stillness. Lucas finally asked if he should take me home. The question wasn't a test. It was an opening. I took a breath and nodded. As the car pulled back onto the road, I realized that nothing had happened, and yet everything felt different. The stop had lasted only minutes, but it had drawn a line through my thoughts I couldn't erase. When he dropped me off, there was no lingering goodbye. Just a quiet, understanding look and a simple take care. I walked away knowing that the hardest part wasn't what we had almost done, but what I had allowed myself to feel. But that second night, I became painfully aware of how thin the walls of my life really were. From the outside, nothing had changed. I still woke up beside Mark, still drank coffee from the same chipped mug, still answered messages with the same predictable rhythm. But inside, a quiet storm had taken root. Wasn't hiding a secret meeting or stolen moments. I was hiding a feeling, and that somehow felt heavier. Mark noticed my distraction before he mentioned it. He always did. He asked if work was stressing me out, if I needed a break, if everything was okay. I told him I was just tired, and he accepted that answer because it was easier than pushing. Watching him do that hurt more than an argument would have. It reminded me how long we had both been choosing peace over honesty. At night. I lay awake thinking about that stopped car, about how a stranger had given me space to speak without asking for anything in return. It made me question what I was missing and, more dangerously, what I was avoiding. I wasn't proud of the comparison I kept making between Lucas and Mark, but it happened anyway. Lucas represented possibility and Mark represented commitment. I loved Mark, but love felt quieter now, almost fragile. Days passed. I told myself that distance would solve everything, that I could fold the experience into memory and move forward. But when Lucas's name appeared on my phone one evening, my breath caught. He hadn't pushed his way into my life. I had given him my number that night without thinking. His message was simple, respectful, asking how I was doing. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Our conversation stayed light at first. Nothing secretive, nothing inappropriate. And yet, I found myself waiting for his replies in a way I hadn't waited for anything in years. He asked questions that made me think, that made me look inward instead of outward. With him, I didn't feel the need to perform or protect. That he's felt like a quiet betrayal all on its own. One evening, he asked if I wanted to sit and talk somewhere public. No pressure, no expectations. I knew I should say no. I knew that the right choice was distance, silence, self-control. Instead, I said yes, convincing myself that honesty was safer than avoidance. We met at a small cafe tucked away from the noise of the city. There were people around, laughter, clinking cups, reality keeping us grounded. Seeing him outside the car felt strangely intimate. He was exactly as calm as I remembered, the same steady presence. We talked for hours about music, childhood memories, the versions of ourselves we thought we'd be by now. Every so often, our conversation drifted close to dangerous territory, and each time, one of us gently pulled it back. That restraint made the connection feel deeper, not weaker. At one point, Lucas asked me a question I'd been avoiding myself. He asked if I was happy. I didn't answer right away. I thought about Mark, about the love that still existed, about the resentment I never voiced. I told Lucas that happiness wasn't a simple yes or no. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. He said he didn't want to be a reason someone broke a promise. Hearing that both relieved and unsettled me. As we sat there, I realized something uncomfortable. The line I crossed wasn't physical or obvious. It was emotional. I had shared parts of myself with Lucas that I had kept hidden from the person who deserved them most. That realization filled me with guilt, but also clarity. I couldn't keep pretending that this was harmless when it was changing how I felt. When we finally stood to leave, the air between us was heavy with unspoken words. Lucas thanked me for the honesty and told me that whatever I chose next, I should choose it fully. There was no plea in his voice, no manipulation, just respect. That made the choice feel entirely mine. Walking home, I felt the weight of that invisible line pressing against my chest. I hadn't crossed it with my body, but my heart had wandered close enough to feel the edge. I knew that if I didn't face the truth soon, I would lose something, either my relationship or my sense of who I was trying to be. The days that followed felt slower, like time had decided to watch me instead of move with me. I carried the weight of my thoughts everywhere, to work, to the grocery store, even into the quiet moments at home where Mark and I used to laugh without effort. Nothing dramatic happened, yet everything felt delicate, as if one careless word could crack the life we had built. Mark sensed the distance more clearly now. He reached for my hand more often, asked deeper questions, tried in small ways to reconnect. His effort stirred something painful in me, a mix of love, guilt, and regret. I heard if this was what fear looked like when it realized it might lose something valuable. Watching him try made my silence feel cruel. At night, I replayed conversations with Lucas. Not the words themselves, but the feeling of being understood. I hated that my mind went there when it should have been focused on the person beside me. I reminded myself that Lucas had never asked for more, never pushed past the boundaries I was struggling to define. Conflict lived entirely inside me. One evening, Mark asked if we could talk. Not the casual kind of talk, but the kind that carries weight. We sat across from each other, the room dim except for a lamp that cast long shadows on the walls. He told me he felt like I was slipping away, that he didn't know how to reach me anymore. His voice wasn't angry, just tired. That honesty cut deeper than blame ever could. I wanted to confess everything. to unload the truth and let the consequences fall where they may. But I knew that sharing every detail wouldn't bring clarity, it would bring unnecessary pain. Instead, I spoke about feeling disconnected, about needing more openness, emotional presence from both of us. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Mark listened, eyes steady, admitted he had felt the same distance but didn't know how to name it. Asterisk, the conversation changed the atmosphere between us. We weren't suddenly healed, but we were honest in a way we hadn't been for a long time. Still, when I lay awake later that night, I knew something remained unresolved. The question wasn't just about Mark or Lucas, it was about who I was when no one was watching. Asterisk, Lucas messaged me the next day, checking in without expectation. I stared at my phone, aware that every reply pulled me in a direction. I told him I needed space to figure things out. He understood immediately. His response was gentle, supportive, and final enough to give me room to breathe. The respect in that message stayed with me. Asterisk, the absence of his voice felt louder than I expected. Without it, I was left alone with my thoughts, forced to examine what I had been avoiding. I realized that the real danger hadn't been meeting someone new. It had been using that connection as a mirror instead of facing my own reflection at home. Asterisk, over the next few days, I focused on Mark, not out of obligation, but intention. We talked more, argued a little, laughed occasionally. It was messy and imperfect, but it was real. And with every honest exchange, the pull I felt toward Lucas softened, replaced by something steadier and more grounded. Asterisk, still, late one night, I admitted something to myself I hadn't allowed before. The encounter with Lucas had mattered, not because it threatened to become something more, but because it showed me what was missing and what I needed to fight for. Accepting that truth didn't erase the guilt, but it gave it meaning. Asterisk, as I drifted to sleep, I understood that infidelity doesn't always announce itself with actions. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as understanding, and leaves behind a choice. And the weight of that choice, heavier than any moment of temptation, was finally mine to carry. Time has a way of softening the sharpest moments, but it doesn't erase their lessons. Weeks passed, and the intensity of those nights slowly settled into something quieter, something reflective. Life found its rhythm again, not the same as before, but more aware. I no longer moved through my days on autopilot. Every conversation, every shared silence carried intention. Asterisk, Mark and I didn't fix everything overnight. Real connection rarely works that way. But we began choosing honesty even when it felt uncomfortable. We talked about expectations we'd never voiced, about fears we'd hidden behind routines. Some nights were heavy, others surprisingly light. What mattered was that we were finally present with each other. Not just sharing space, but attention. Asterisk, I never told Mark about Lucas in detail. Not because I was hiding, but because I understood the difference between honesty and harm. The truth he needed was about me, about my distance, my doubts, my desire to be seen. Carrying responsibility meant owning my feelings without transferring their weight onto someone else. Realization felt like growth even if it came late. Asterisk, every so often, I thought about Lucas, not with longing, but with gratitude. He had entered my life briefly and left without demanding anything in return. He had shown me kindness, respect, and restraint, qualities that made the situation more meaningful, not less. I understood now that some people are meant to be moments, not chapters. Asterisk, one evening, while walking home alone, I passed the street where he had first picked me up. The rain had stopped, but the pavement still reflected the city lights. I stood there for a second, remembering how a simple decision had uncovered a truth I couldn't ignore. I didn't feel regret. I felt clarity. Asterisk, I realized that the stop on the road hadn't been about temptation. It had been about awareness. It forced me to see how easily emotional distance can grow when left unspoken, and how important it is to tend to the relationships we claim to value. Love, I learned, isn't just about loyalty and action, but presence and feeling. Asterisk, Mark and I still have work to do. We always will. But now, when we sit together in the quiet, it doesn't feel empty. It feels earned. We've learned how to ask better questions, how to listen without preparing defenses. The connection isn't perfect, but it's honest. Asterisk, as for me, I carry that experience as a reminder that attention is powerful, that understanding can feel intoxicating, and that choices matter long before lines are crossed. Infidelity doesn't always begin with betrayal. Sometimes it begins with silence. Asterisk, if there's one thing that night taught me, it's this: moments don't define us, our responses to them do. And the road may offer many stops along the way, but it's the direction we choose afterward that shapes who we become.